Shadow of the Erdtree has been around for about a month now. I think the rose-tinted glasses are coming off. All the reviewers and the journalists spoke their piece and went away. All the streamers and content creators played it and moved on. So now it's time for normal people to have their say. And my say is this: Shadow of the Erdtree has a fatal flaw. And for once in the history of the English language, fatal flaw is used with its actual meaning. I'm not saying fatal flaw just to be dramatic. I'm not saying it just because I can't think of anything else to say. I actually do mean Shadow of the Erdtree has a flaw that is fatal. A flaw that makes me dislike it to the point where I don't want to play the DLC. It's dead to me. The flaw has been fatal. Now, before I start explaining the fatal flaw, I want to get a couple of things out of the way. Namely, 5 things. Number 1, this is purely subjective, of course. It's my opinion, it's how I feel. It's not gospel truth, it's not objective fact. You don't have to agree with me. And if you do disagree, you are not wrong to do so. Number 2, I'm a big fan of From Software games. I beat the Dark Souls games and Elden Ring multiple times. I'm saying this so you know I'm not being a hater, and I'm not trying to be a hater. I'm not making this video just to be a contrarian. This is coming from a place of love. Number 3, there will be some spoilers, so consider yourself advised for all that matters. Number 4, it is possible that some of my complaints have really good and solid lore explanations. I just want to say up front, that's not an excuse. They could have made the lore any other way and avoided the issues I will talk about. And then finally, there is DLC gameplay in the background, but it's not going to be necessarily relevant to what I'm saying, so you're not missing out if you just listen. Now, if you're not familiar with the Erdtree blessing system, because that's the fatal flaw and that's what this video is about, basically what they did is they doubled the enemy health and damage and then scattered these items around, called Erdtree fragments, as a way to deal with the artificially inflated enemy stats. These fragments allow you to upgrade your blessing level, increasing the damage you deal and decreasing the amount of damage you take. So at the maximum level of blessing, which is 20, you deal double damage and take half damage, essentially nullifying the scaling introduced by the DLC. There's also a similar system in place for spirit summons, called Revered Spirit Ash, and it works basically the same way. Now, before I continue, I should mention Scadu actually means shadow in Old English, so these names could be pronounced as Shadow Tree Blessing and Shadow Tree Fragment. I'll keep calling it Erdtree though, because it sounds stupid, so it is more fitting to how I feel about the system. Anyway, there are 50 Erdtree fragments and 25 Revered Spirit Ashes to be found. This system and these items are only relevant in the DLC and have no effect in the base game. There's also no surplus of them, so you need to find all of them for the maximum blessing. So why was this system implemented? As far as I can tell, there was no official statement given by From Software in which they directly address why they made this decision, but from interviews and places I was able to surmise 2 reasons. Number 1 is having a difficulty curve or some sense of progression, and number 2 is encouraging exploration. Shadow of the Erdtree was released over 2 years after the base game, so it was reasonable to assume players would have powerful characters ready to go. At the very least, players would have the knowledge of how to build a powerful character. So the developers were worried that people would take these fully built characters into the DLC and then steamroll through the content in a few hours. So they tried avoiding that via the blessing system. I don't much care for this reasoning. If people want to steamroll through the content, let them. They still paid for the DLC, so I don't see what the problem is. The base game doesn't gate content in this way. Maybe the developers wanted to justify the $40 launch price, so they gated progression in such a way that people would feel they got their money's worth. Or maybe it was a response to every review of the base game. They all said the same thing. They said something along the lines of Elden Ring is a perfect game, a 9 out of 10, a 10 out of 10, but its open world nature makes it too easy for players to become overpowered. That's literally all of the reviews have said that. You can go back and watch any of them, I guarantee it, with my life that they all say that. Anyway, that's the whole point of making Elden Ring open world, was to give players choices or on where to go and to become more powerful so they can meet challenges that way. But I don't see that as a flaw. Evidently, I'm in the minority here. I just don't understand why they couldn't use the base game scaling. Like, Elden Ring already has difficulty spikes. Crumbling Farum Azula springs immediately to mind, but there are others too. This company knows how to balance a game without having to implement an entirely new system. There's just no need for it. It completely negates people's builds from the base game in favor of what? In favor of inflated numbers that can then be deflated by going on what is essentially an Easter egg hunt. And if they absolutely had to scatter items around for players to find, they could have gated content through literal keys and literal gates that players would need to find, and those would unlock various bosses or areas. You might say that's too video gamey, that it lacks flair, but it's not like the current system is awfully subtle and elaborate. They created a problem and provided a solution, and they could have done it any other way without making players feel like their builds don't matter. Better idea would be that they could have had bosses drop the fragments instead of finding them in the middle of nowhere, and each boss would require more and more fragments to be collected. This way you have progression, and you also encourage exploration. If a boss is too difficult, you would need to know that you need to go and fight and find a different boss, and not go looking for items in the middle of nowhere. And the funniest thing about that is they already did it this way in Sekiro, so it's not like they needed an epiphany or some sort of revelation in order to implement it in Elden Ring. They already did that before. But the thing is, the DLC doesn't need progression. It's end game content. Like, by the time I get to the DLC, I've done my fair share of progressing. By the time I get to the DLC, I will have already collected 97 smithing stones for just one maxed out weapon, and 30 golden seeds, and 12 sacred tears for my flask, plus additional items like cracked tears for the physic flask, ashes of war, spells. I obviously don't really have a problem with progression or collecting items. On the contrary, I mentioned multiple times in the past that I start new playthroughs more often than I finish them. And you can check that by watching my Elden Ring playthrough, plug, where I do mention that several times. And I do that because the early progression is very satisfying. But there's a time and a place for progression. You know, early to mid-game, that's where progression is good. But, you know, I don't have a problem with the blessing system in a vacuum. I wouldn't be against it as a progression system in a new or a separate game. But as it stands now, at the end of Elden Ring, I have a fully built character. I don't want any more progression. I don't want to collect any more upgrade materials. Like, what is this obsession with progression? It feels Sisyphean at times. Like, must there be a progression curve from the very beginning all the way to the very end? And once progression ends, that's it, the game ends too, and you see the credits? Like, that's bad game design, in my opinion. I did the work, now let me enjoy the fruits of my labor for a while. You let me become powerful, now let me be powerful for a while. Now, as far as encouraging exploration is concerned, this system feels insecure and anxious. Elden Ring released in 2022, over 2 years now, so did they really think they had to force players to explore new content? And instead of just letting natural human curiosity and the novelty of a new map work its magic and encourage exploration that way, they chose to implement an entirely new gameplay mechanic that negates dozens of hours of progress made in the base game. Like, were they not confident in what they created? How insecure must they have been to do this? And the funniest thing is, the system doesn't encourage exploration, it has the opposite effect. Like, when I learned there are 75 of these fucking things that I need to find, and I need to find all of them, and there is little consistency in the rules dictating how to actually find them, I felt anything but encouraged. I felt discouraged. You know, exploration is my favorite part of FromSoft games, but turning exploration into an obligation is anything but enjoyable. And this is coming from a company that used to be so confident that they would hide entire areas and bosses behind double or triple illusory walls. And they even did that in Elden Ring. The only thing they encourage with this Scooby-Doo blessing system is looking up a guide for all the fragments. And guess what? You don't need to look up just one guide, you need to look up two guides because the system is split between two different item types. So much fun to be had, are you not entertained? Now the base game also has many items to collect in order to become more powerful, as I mentioned earlier. So you might wonder, what's the big deal? Why is the base game good and the DLC bad? Well, the difference is that the base game items are either clearly marked on the map, or they're easily found without the map, and there is a surplus of these items. Or if there's not a surplus, there's not many of them to find, so looking them up is easy. The DLC does not subscribe to any of this. The items are not marked on the map, most of them are not easily found, there's not a surplus of them, and there are many of them to be found. Now, I should say at this point there's not actually 75 different individual locations you have to go to in order to find all these items. There's several locations where you can find 2 or 3 Erdtree fragments. There's even a location where there's 5 of them. So the number of total locations is maybe closer to 50 perhaps for all 75 items. It's still not a walk in the park, but I thought I should mention it. It's also worth mentioning that the blessing system was adjusted via a balance patch. So most of the bonuses are gained by reaching blessing level 12, which requires 26 Erdtree fragments, so just over half. After level 12 you get diminishing returns. So some people say level 12 is all you need. And it's like, yes, you do get diminishing returns in that you get way more damage up to level 12 than you get beyond it. But it's still a significant difference in damage. Like the difference between blessing level 12 and blessing level 20 is 20% more damage, I'm pretty sure. Because blessing level 12 gives you 1.85x damage. And blessing level 20 gives you 2.05x damage. So it's 20% more damage. I think the math is correct on that. It's certainly more than enough to make a difference. And it's certainly more than enough to have in the back of your mind during a difficult boss fight. You know, if the DLC had a talisman that increases or increased all damage by 20%, it would be an instant S tier. Like they would invent a new tier above S tier just for that talisman. You know, I can only hope the developers will continue to release balance patches until the maximum bonuses require 0 Erdtree fragments. Circling back to the core of the issue, let's say for the sake of the argument that the system does encourage exploration. They really wanted players to see all the areas in the DLC, so they came up with this fucked up system to achieve that. So it's not technically encouraging exploration, they're forcing it. Okay, fine, let's pretend it works for a first playthrough, you know, rose-tinted glasses and all that. But what about subsequent playthroughs? It may be fine on a first playthrough because of the excitement and the novelty, but after that it just becomes exhausting to even think about. Like they could have done nothing, and this would have potentially added value to subsequent playthroughs because there would be stuff to discover that you might have missed the first time. But since the Skibidi system forces you to go everywhere, you see everything, so there's nothing to discover on subsequent playthroughs. It's certainly not enough to warrant an entire second playthrough. And keep in mind, this is endgame content, so to start a second playthrough of the DLC also means starting and finishing another playthrough of Elden Ring. And then going to New Game Plus isn't a solution either, because the blessing upgrades don't carry over. So you have to collect the Scooby-Doo fragments every time you start the DLC, no matter what. You know, it's like they wanted the progression of a linear game in an open world game. They wanted it both ways. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too. And it's so weird. The enemy scaling is so weird, no matter what you do. You know, it used to be that you would get to a new area and you could gauge if you were ready for it by how much damage you did to the most basic enemies. Like if you killed them in 2 or 3 hits at most, you would know that you could proceed. But the DLC doesn't work like that. You have these basic enemies, these shadow people, and they always die in 1 or 2 hits. And then pretty much everyone else is either a mini-boss or a boss. So you're either doing all the damage or no damage at all. There's no way to organically know if you're ready for a boss. This further encourages looking up a guide to make sure you didn't miss any Scooby-Doo fragments, because there's no way to know if you're okay to proceed. You know, I spent a lot of time thinking about this DLC and about this stupid fucking blessing system. And I have to admit that when thinking about it or talking about it, even now as I'm recording it, it doesn't actually sound all that bad. It's like just look up a guide, go to the locations and pick up the items, right? You don't even have to fight anything for like the first 12 levels of blessing, and that's allegedly all you need nowadays. And it's like, yeah, it doesn't sound like a huge problem, but when I have to actually do it, I instantly get hit with open world fatigue. It's quite a big map actually, it's about half the size of the base game, roughly. And you obviously can't fast travel anywhere at the beginning, so you just have to ride torrent all over the place. And it takes a while, and it's boring. It's not difficult, it's boring. It puts me off playing the DLC. And again, this is endgame content, so I'm doing this after an entire playthrough of Elden Ring. And also, the DLC world is very vertical, so navigating it is anything but straightforward. But more on that later. Now, just to be clear, I don't mind the DLC as extra content, even though I think Elden Ring is big enough on its own. In a perfect world, that is to say a world in which the Erdtree blessing doesn't exist, I could see myself playing the DLC every once in a while. I just feel disrespected. I just feel like I'm putting dozens of hours into Elden Ring to build a character, and then it just gets taken away or just ignored, and I have to start over essentially. You know, and it just feels disrespectful, especially coming after over a decade of Souls games that respected the player in this way. And look at them now. It's like, look at what they've done. It's disgusting. It's artificial. It's lazy. They could have done nothing and it would have been better. Like, tell me that's not heartbreaking. They went out of their way to do this, and it still would have been better had they done nothing. It's a shame. I just hope this was an experiment, and I hope they consider the experiment to have failed. Now on to some little things that I don't like about the DLC that I couldn't fit anywhere else, but I want to mention anyway. These are mostly nitpicks, but here goes. The map is useless, as in the actual map used for navigating. The Realm of Shadow is very convoluted and vertical. Going from one area to the next is never as simple as it appears on the map. A lot of area transitions in the DLC happen under like a rock arch or a tunnel, and the map makes those transitional points look like dead ends, because that's what dead ends look like on the base game map. There's a big section of an area that is located under this plateau, and instead of showing the layout of the area, the map just shows the plateau and not what's under it. And you can't even get on top of that plateau, so it's completely useless. It's a bad map, and it might as well not exist for all the good that it does. The final boss was disappointing in terms of who it is, in terms of the character. It's a returning, or I should say recycled character from the base game. It's Radahn, and it feels like fan service, which ironically I'm not a fan of. You know, in a DLC with so many new bosses, having the final boss be not new is disappointing, even though functionally it's a different fight. Like, you wouldn't recognize the final boss as Radahn if it looked different, but it doesn't look different, and it's disappointing. It almost feels like the DLC is a spin-off or a mini sequel, or was intended to be a separate game, and then they decided to make it into Elden Ring DLC. It just doesn't feel integrated with the base game, and it's kind of disappointing. As an example of that, Miquella is the focus of the DLC. And if you don't know, Miquella is Malenia's twin brother. So if you kill Malenia before going to the DLC, you might expect Miquella to react in some way to his sister's death. But no, nothing happens. You might then say that From Software's DLCs have never been connected in this way to their respective games, so I shouldn't expect Elden Ring's DLC to be any different. Okay, apparently it's okay to innovate with this stupid fucking blessing system, but everything else is sacrosanct and must not break tradition. It's okay to break tradition by artificially inflating enemy stats, but it's not okay to break tradition by connecting the base game to its DLC in any meaningful way. Moving on, the loot is pretty much useless. There's a lot of smithing stones around, which would have been great in the base game, but they're pointless in an endgame area like the DLC. By the time you start the DLC, you should not only have a fully upgraded weapon or two, but you should also have the ability to buy all the smithing stones you need. So I don't see the point in having them as loot. There is, however, a bunch of final upgrade stones though, and that's actually nice to have. You know, I can forgive the final boss. It's just one fight after all, and it's literally the last one. I can forgive the useless map and the pointless loot and all the other nitpicks I just mentioned. But I cannot and will not forgive the blessing system. I tried giving the DLC a second chance with a different character, but after running around for a while collecting the early Erdtree fragments, I just stopped giving a fuck. At one point I had to stop and be honest with myself and admit I'm not enjoying myself. And I just don't like playing the DLC, and it's all because of this stupid fucking blessing system. Now, to end on a positive note, there are things I actually like about the DLC. The world is beautiful and striking to look at. All the areas have a distinct aesthetic and leave a very strong first impression. The legacy dungeons are fun to explore. They're some of the best content From Software has ever made. All the locations actually are really good. Even the caves and the catacombs, like they clearly put a lot of effort into this DLC. Some of the new weapons and armors look really cool. There's some very useful talismans, and some really cool ones, both new ones and upgraded versions of existing ones. There's a lot to like, but it's ruined by the blessing system. Shadow of the Erdtree is a very good piece of content with a fatal flaw. And believe me when I say, I gave this DLC a very good shot. I took a whole week off to play Shadow of the Erdtree. I didn't have any other responsibilities, and I could have played it for 16 hours a day if I wanted to. But I didn't want to, and see above why. I'm a grown man with responsibilities and a full-time job. I simply don't have the time and patience to look for unnecessary items in the middle of nowhere so I can do the damage I should have been able to do in the first place. You know, I spent so long thinking about this DLC that I'm starting to have doubts. Maybe the blessing system makes perfect sense and I'm just missing something that's very obvious and I look like an idiot now. Feel free to comment down below if you still think the blessing system is good, having considered my opinion. I do want to like this DLC, so please feel free to try and convince me if you happen to disagree with me. I wish you the best of luck with that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you enjoyed the DLC, because I sure haven't. Thank you for watching, I wish you a great day ahead of you, and a goodbye.